Monsieur l'ancien recteur de l'Université de Genève, Monsieur le doyen de la faculté de médecine, chers collègues, chers amis, chères étudiantes, chers étudiants, une thématique d'une très grande importance, en particulier pour notre université. Et je me permettrai de vous dire à quel point je suis heureux d'être ce soir avec vous pour entendre une conférence qui va aborder des thèmes de la plus haute importance pour, je pense, toutes les universités à travers le monde, mais en particulier pour notre université de Genève, parce que vous l'avez compris et entendu, cette thématique de la liberté d'expression a eu pas mal de résonance au sein de notre communauté. Cette question de la liberté d'expression est une question particulièrement difficile, une question qui pourrait paraître parfois simple à aborder, mais on constate effectivement, et on l'a vu dans notre université, que c'était une question qui est beaucoup plus complexe que ce qui peut sembler de prime abord. Même si, par ailleurs, ces conceptions ou ces notions de liberté d'expression, de liberté académique sont définies dans un certain nombre de nos chartes constitutives, la charte d'éthique et de déontologie en particulier, on s'aperçoit que ce sont des thématiques que nous devons aborder à travers des conférences telles que celles qu'on aura l'occasion d'entendre ce soir. Alors évidemment, sans d'une part déflorer le sujet qui va être abordé tout à l'heure, et peut-être en prenant quelques libertés par rapport à ce sujet, je m'en excuse par rapport à la conférencière immédiatement, j'aimerais évidemment ouvrir cette conférence en disant tout d'abord qu'il nous faut distinguer un certain nombre de notions. La liberté académique tout d'abord, évidemment, la liberté d'expression ensuite, et on s'aperçoit que parfois l'une est confondue avec l'autre, ou l'une et l'autre sont utilisées de manière tout à fait identique, alors qu'elles sont par un certain nombre d'aspects différentes. Et puis aussi la notion de liberté d'engagement, qui est peut-être un troisième concept que j'aimerais aussi très rapidement aborder. Encore une fois, en m'excusant auprès de la conférencière, parce que je ne suis pas certain que ce sont des thématiques qui seront abordées par la conférencière, mais j'abuse de ce pouvoir de recteur pour pouvoir vous les évoquer. Alors tout d'abord, la liberté académique, il faut distinguer deux conceptions. La liberté académique au niveau institutionnel, celle qui est malheureusement souvent mise à mal par des interventions qui réduisent l'autonomie de notre université ou des universités, lorsque parfois le monde politique a des velléités de définir ce que l'on doit enseigner, comment on doit enseigner, ce que l'on doit rechercher, ce que l'on ne devrait pas rechercher. C'est une notion évidemment extrêmement importante et qui se réfère directement à notre autonomie. Ensuite, il y a évidemment la liberté académique au niveau individuel, et celle-ci se réfère très directement à la liberté que les enseignants, les enseignantes, les chercheuses et chercheurs ont de pouvoir enseigner les thématiques, les domaines qu'ils ont choisis, mais aussi dans les thématiques de recherche qu'ils entendent développer, toujours évidemment des libertés qui ne sont pas absolues, qui ont des limites, et sans doute qu'on sera amené à y revenir. Mais c'est aussi évidemment la liberté d'expression. On l'aura compris, la liberté d'expression est constitutive de la liberté académique, mais elle va bien au-delà, puisqu'elle ne peut pas être réservée évidemment aux seuls universitaires que nous sommes. Cette liberté académique, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, elle doit évidemment s'exercer dans un cadre bien défini, celui de la déontologie, qui doit nous amener à nous interroger sur la responsabilité du chercheur et des chercheuses et des chercheurs à l'égard de la société, à l'égard des collègues et des étudiantes et des étudiants. Finalement, la liberté académique et la liberté d'expression doivent être distinguées de la notion de l'engagement public, celui que l'on exerce en tant que citoyenne ou citoyen, et celui que l'on peut utiliser en tant qu'universitaire. Un engagement qui se traduit par une démarche, une prise de parole ou tout autre acte public qui a un contenu normatif, engagement. Et cet engagement-là fait l'objet aujourd'hui de maintes critiques, vous le savez, essentiellement parce qu'il peut être considéré parfois comme une utilisation abusive du pouvoir du chercheur ou de la chercheuse, et parce qu'il n'est pas toujours possible de séparer clairement les résultats scientifiques de l'opinion personnelle. Cet engagement fait partie du rôle des chercheuses et chercheurs, et Samia Urs l'a magnifiquement interprété lors des dernières années de Covid, dans lesquelles effectivement elle s'est engagée en faveur de la collectivité pour comprendre ce qui se passait dans notre société, pour voir comment on devait aborder cette crise épidémique. Plein de sujets, évidemment, que je me réjouis de pouvoir discuter peut-être en marge de la conférence que nous aurons le plaisir d'entendre de la professeure Teresa Bejan ce soir. Et vous me permettrez peut-être de conclure en paraphrasant maladroitement les propos tenus par Samia Urs lors d'une grande conférence que nous avions déjà organisée sur le thème de la liberté d'expression. Je crois que c'était il y a peut-être 2 ans en arrière. Alors je la paraphrase un tout petit peu, mais il y avait un thème qui m'a beaucoup évidemment plu dans ce que Samia nous a dit. Nous avons la chance d'avoir à Genève une université polyvalente qui nous offre toute la diversité des disciplines pour aborder les sujets les plus complexes qui ne pourront jamais être traités de manière satisfaisante sous le prisme d'un seul regard. Samia lançait d'ailleurs après, à l'adresse de notre communauté, un message fort que je voudrais reprendre ce soir. Soyez curieux, cherchez toujours à comprendre, même et peut-être surtout, ce avec quoi vous n'êtes pas d'accord, mais faites-le toujours avec civilité. Merci beaucoup d'être présent ce soir et je passe maintenant la parole à Samia Urs. Je vous souhaite une excellente soirée. Merci de votre attention.
La professeure Teresa Bejan, que j'ai le plaisir d'introduire ce soir, enseigne la théorie politique à l'Université d'Oxford, où, comme vous le savez sans doute, l'université est composée de collèges différents et elle est fellow de l'Oriel College. Ses recherches apportent une perspective historique à des questions de théorie politique actuelle. Elle a écrit sur plusieurs thèmes, entre autres la liberté d'expression, la civilité, la tolérance, l'égalité. Et elle les inscrit dans un contexte historique qui est vaste, qui va de l'Antiquité à notre contexte actuel. Son premier livre, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, publié en 2017 et sorti en poche en 2019, juste à temps avant l'éclatement de la crise du Covid-19 qui a donné une autre actualité à ces questions, examinait les appels contemporains à la civilité à la lumière des débats du XVIIe siècle sur la tolérance religieuse. Un appel à une profondeur historique donc, autour d'une idée très particulière et qui n'a jamais perdu en importance, l'idée de la coexistence des idées. Parce que dans l'histoire des idées, on s'attarde trop rarement sur la manifestation concrète des désaccords, en fait, des désaccords qui accompagnent aussi les évolutions, les changements, les mouvements dans différentes époques du passé. Et donc, on a parfois trop tendance à oublier que la manière de vivre ces désaccords est une thématique en elle-même, qui peut faire l'objet de progrès, qui peut faire l'objet d'hésitations, parfois de zigzags. Et ce chapitre, dans la plupart des lieux de notre culture occidentale, tout du moins, a tendance à être compliqué. Je vais vous donner un seul exemple, mais il y en aurait eu beaucoup d'autres. Cet exemple, à titre d'exemple, j'aimerais vous citer ici une figure, celle de Sébastien Castellón, appelé par Calvin pour être recteur du Collège de Rives en 1541. De l'institution donc, qui est la première tentative d'instaurer une école sous la Réforme, qui sera suivie des années plus tard par la fondation de l'Académie, qui donnera ensuite naissance à la fois au Collège de Genève et à notre université. Il est donc un peu précurseur de nos recteurs actuels, Sébastien Castellón. Il commence par être en très bons termes avec Jean Calvin, mais assez rapidement, il s'oppose à lui précisément sur la question du droit à l'opinion personnelle en matière de foi. Sentant venir avec ce désaccord un vent mauvais ou un vent tout du moins qui ne lui plaît pas beaucoup, il va se relocaliser à Bâle seulement 4 ans après son arrivée à Genève. En 1554, il réagira à la condamnation au bûcher de Michel Servet par Calvin l'année précédente en publiant son traité des hérétiques où se trouve sa phrase la plus célèbre « Tuer un homme, ce n'est pas défendre une doctrine, c'est tuer un homme. Quand les Genevois ont fait périr Servet, ils ne défendaient pas une doctrine, ils tuaient un être humain. On ne prouve pas sa foi en brûlant un homme, mais en se faisant brûler pour elle. » Nous avons heureusement fait quelques progrès depuis. La question du droit d'exprimer ses opinions ne fait plus brûler personne sur les hauteurs de Genève. Cette question ne s'est toutefois jamais entièrement apaisée. Qu'a-t-on le droit de dire dans une société tolérante ? La difficulté de répondre précisément à cette question nous guette en permanence et nous ne cessons d'en avoir des exemples dans notre société contemporaine. C'est d'autant plus difficile que ces débats sont peuplés d'accusations généralement mutuelles de manquer à des règles dont seule une partie, après tout, sont écrites. Je me réjouis donc tout particulièrement de la conférence de ce soir. Professor Bejan, we are thrilled to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Well, merci beaucoup. Thank you, Professor Hurst, also Monsieur le Recteur, for that wonderful introduction. Also thanks to Dr. Suchu and Constance Muller for bringing me here. It's really exciting to be here. And I'm honored, really, to speak to you today on this important topic, on the history of civility, of free speech, and of tolerance. And to do so here in Geneva, which, as we've heard, is a city with its own fascinating and occasionally problematic history with respect to religious conflict and coexistence. So Jean Calvin may have died over 450 years ago, but those of us lucky enough to live in this liberal democracy and others today are still confronting problems and challenges that he would have recognized, and indeed as would have Sebastian Castellio. Because liberal democracies like Switzerland or like the United Kingdom, where I live now, or the United States, where I'm from, they also aspire to be tolerant societies as well as free societies. And so in those tolerant societies, we wrestle with passionate conflicts over believing and belonging in politics now, more so often than in religion. And we worry about just how much diversity a tolerant society can handle before it begins to shake itself apart. Today, it seems more than ever we're convinced that what we say to each other, as well as how we say it, is particularly important in a tolerant society. These are societies that value disagreement, value diversity, but they also encourage their members to disagree about their differences and to express themselves freely in the process of those disagreements. And indeed, the freedom of speech has historically, at least, been seen as an essential implication of religious freedom or the liberty of conscience. So if we protect liberty of conscience, the next step seems that we would then also protect the freedom of speech. And yet today, in tolerant societies like this one, and also in my own, free speech is also at the center of many controversies about hate speech, for instance, and blasphemy, but also more contemporary questions like concerns about microaggressions or the politics of language, and indeed the politics of pronouns. In all of these controversies, it can seem to many people that free speech is not so much about protecting liberty of conscience, it's more about a kind of license to offend, or even a kind of vehicle for intolerance. So we've grown suspicious of freedom of speech and its place in a tolerant society. And so thus far in my lecture, I've talked about tolerant societies, liberal democracies like Switzerland or the United Kingdom. But I think also on the agenda may be a question about the university as a tolerant society. Is the university understood properly as a tolerant society or something else? And I think in the midst of all of these debates about tolerance and free speech, we can witness the revival of something that the 20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper, once described as the paradox of tolerance. So I'll quote Popper for you. Quote, "If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant." So some of you may be familiar with this paradox of tolerance. It's been memed on social media. You might have seen it on Twitter. But in any case, I'm interested in the way that Popper's paradox of tolerance is being revived today and applied to speech. And particularly the argument that people who reveal themselves to be intolerant by what they say show that they have no place themselves in our tolerant society. For centuries, though, the precise limit of speech in a tolerant society was meant to have been set by a rather old-fashioned conversational virtue. It's the conversational virtue we call civility. Diversity is good, we say, disagreement is great, so long as our tolerant society also remains a civil society. So I've been invited to speak to you today, among other things, about civility. And I get invited to give a lot of lectures like these because I now have a reputation after writing my book that I'm a kind of expert on civility. I think that's a really dubious distinction, right? Because one of the most interesting things about civility is no one's ever really clear what it actually means or what it entails or what a civil disagreement looks like. I mean, to put it skeptically, why on earth would anyone think that talking to each other, no matter how civilly, about the things that divide us most deeply, would bring us closer together? That seems completely insane, even if we could manage to do it with more civility. Surely the tolerant thing to do would be to agree to disagree, no? Accept our differences, move on. And on that view, what we need is not more civility. We need something more like civil silence, a willingness to leave certain topics off the agenda and move on to more agreeable matters. And if indeed our differences are so deep, so fundamental, that we simply can't move on or even get past them, well, it seems like we'd better learn to live with incivility and accept that a civil disagreement simply isn't on the cards. I would say that many young people today, especially, I see some young people in the audience, many young people today are suspicious of civility and sort of worry that civility isn't a solution to the problems that our tolerant societies face, but really an apology for those problems, or civility itself is a kind of demand that we tolerate intolerance. It's the revival, again, of Popper's paradox. Surely in the face of hatred or injustice, good manners are tantamount to complicity. Civility isn't a virtue at all on this view. It's a vice, one that both demands deference to an unjust status quo, but also that delegitimizes dissent or complaints against that unjust status quo and works to marginalize those who are already marginal. And on this view, which I should say for you now is not my view, but it's a worry I take really seriously. On this view, we need less civility in a tolerant society, not more, and a culture clearer than ever on what it won't tolerate. And so the time for civil disagreement, some would say, is over, that of righteous outrage, public shaming, disruption, and calling out of our opponents has begun. Okay? So I think that this description of the moment we're in, I think, may be familiar to many of you. I know that these are challenges that I wrestle with, and I know my university wrestles with, and others across the world as well. And these problems, though, of civility, tolerance, free speech, I always insist to people that these are really pressing problems. They're difficult problems. But they're not unprecedented problems. And indeed, if we look to history, we can see that there's some interesting examples that might help us to think through some of the things that we're wrestling with today. And so what I want to do in my lecture for you is to explore the meaning of civility in light of a long and complicated history. It's a history, as we'll see, that came to a head in early modern European debates about religious tolerance in the years following the Protestant Reformation. The close connection with tolerance explains, I think, why members of a 21st century society like this one why we find ourselves appealing to what is frankly an old-fashioned or early modern concept like civility when it comes to the fundamental disagreements that are driving us apart. The history of civility also reveals that this conversational virtue has always been controversial, and we'll see that the rebellion against civility began almost as soon as the concept was invoked to quiet a religious controversy. And so today I'm also going to introduce you to some of civility's earliest critics, Protestant dissenters who were justifiably suspicious that the prosecution of incivility was just another form of persecution. While this forgotten history suggests that civility's modern critics are right to be suspicious, civility is often a tool, we'll say, of suppression and exclusion, I'll also argue that it doesn't then follow that civility itself is a vice. nor does it follow that conscientious incivility is the virtue that some people sometimes make it out to be. And so I'll conclude by showing how an early Calvinist defender of religious toleration, and in doing so he went against the teachings of his founder, this early modern English Calvinist, a man named Roger Williams, who founded the colony of Rhode Island, stumbled upon the idea that I call mere civility, and argued that in a tolerant society, people might disagree deeply and routinely about the fundamentals, but nevertheless live on terms of mere civility. Okay, but before I get into all of that history, I think it's really important to start at the beginning with the most important question of all. What on earth is civility? What is this? For many people, I think, they hear the word civility and they think, oh, okay, well, that's obvious. Civility it's like a synonym for politeness, for courtesy, for good manners, right? Simple enough. But if that were right, if that were all that civility entailed, then I think it would really be a thin branch to hang our hopes on, if you will. If we want to be more precise, though, I think that we can define civility as a conversational virtue that is akin to courtesy or politeness or respect, but it's nonetheless distinct in certain important ways. And so what are those ways? Well, one, by conversational virtue, I mean that civility is a virtuous disposition or standard of excellence that is meant to govern how people speak to one another. But civility, unlike courtesy, applies to one kind of speaking in particular. It applies to disagreement. It's not any conversation that we worry about whether or not it's civil. We worry that disagreements are civil, or if they're uncivil. And so civility is meant to manage disagreement. The 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes had a good idea of why we worry so much about managing disagreement when he pointed out that disagreeable is a synonym for unpleasant. This is also true in French, is it not? To be disagreeable? Okay, good. So Hobbes explained the disagreeableness of disagreement as follows, quote, "The mere act of disagreement is offensive, because not to agree with someone on an issue is tacitly to accuse him of error, just as to dissent from him in a large number of points is tantamount to calling him a fool." So Hobbes's point here is that disagreement itself is a form of insult. When we disagree with someone, we're accusing them of having reasoned incorrectly, and we're possibly even imputing to them dastardly motives. Why have they reasoned incorrectly? Why don't they see that I'm right? Okay? So this disagreeableness of disagreement, I argue, is why the virtue of civility becomes so important. Disagreement is difficult, but civility is meant to help us manage it, to massage it, to nevertheless continue to get along. And it's not just any disagreement that civility is important for. It's one class of disagreement in particular, the disagreements that I call fundamental disagreements. Okay, so fundamental disagreements are those differences of opinion that we regard as somehow foundational to our worldviews, but also to our identities. And increasingly, these are disagreements where we define ourselves against our opponents. We establish our identities in opposition to others on where we stand on these fundamental questions. So historically, you might say questions of religion, of politics, but increasingly today, I think the number of fundamental disagreements has expanded. We might think questions about the politics of popular culture can also lead to fundamental and fraught disagreements. The point is that these disagreements go to the heart of how we see the world, but also how we see each other. These disagreements of believing and belonging begin to feel particularly fraught, I think. But civility, nevertheless, holds out the hope that we'll be able to disagree fundamentally in a way that's possibly even productive. Okay, so here we come, though, to the second peculiar feature of civility. So in contrast with other conversational virtues like courtesy or politeness, civility is distinguished by its minimal character. It seems to have even negative overtones sometimes. To be merely civil to someone is to sort of meet a low bar grudgingly. We might think of civility as the virtue that's most pertinent to our disagreements with bad neighbors, or ex-spouses even, maybe, ex-partners, right? You're merely civil to the people that you really struggle to get along with. So I like to think of mere civility as describing a floor, not a ceiling. right? It's about this kind of minimal level. Finally, the third peculiar feature of civility has to do with its etymology, with its linguistic origins. Civility has many cognates in modern English and in French. We think of words like civil, civilian, civilization, citizen. These all derive from the Latin word civitas, meaning both the body of citizens or else the state. And so for me, this indicates that civility is a virtue that we think applies to relations between people who stand in a kind of relationship together. That is, they may be co-citizens, but I think it's something even more fundamental. They're people who are involuntarily thrown in to society with others. It's the idea that we have to be civil to those people with whom we share a life, even though we have not chosen it. So that unchosenness, I think, also explains why we find fundamental disagreements so difficult. Why are we stuck with these people anyway, right? Civility is meant to be the virtue that helps us get along despite. Okay. And so given this, I think, we have these three features. I think this helps explain why when we say that someone is being uncivil, we're saying something quite different to saying that they're being impolite or rude. To be uncivil is something that's quite threatening. It suggests that they may be, we have a phrase in English, beyond the pale. I don't know if you have the same phrase in French, but it's an interesting phrase. Beyond the pale comes again from a Latin word where palus means stake, like fence, like a fence. So to say that someone is beyond the pale is to say that they're beyond the fence. But historically, the fence that we were talking about was the pale around the city of Dublin, that was meant to sort of protect the civilized Anglo-Protestants inside the city of Dublin from the sort of barbarous Catholics who were beyond the pale, right? So right there we see, okay, civility and tolerance are deeply intertwined, and it seems like civility alerts us to the element of exclusion that's necessary to constitute a tolerant society. We sort of set up our society and then we become clear on who is uncivil, who does not belong. Again, we're back to Popper's paradox, because surely intolerant people have no place in a tolerant society. That's how the thought runs. And so I'm really interested in this connection between civility and tolerance and the question of what are our duties of being uncivil, being civil towards those we regard as intolerant. Okay. Now, I think in a tolerant society, we hold out the hope of civil disagreement as a kind of promise that we won't resort to violence in the prosecution of our disagreements. So they might be fraught, they might be heavy, they might be fundamental, but nevertheless, we're committed to working these things out with our words, not with our swords. Okay? But then on the flip side of every civil disagreement is this kind of worry that, well, if we can't disagree civilly, then I will have to silence, suppress, or exclude you. Right? So there's always this kind of opposite that's informing us of the risks of not being able to conduct our disagreements civilly. Okay, so that's quite a complex conceptual field that I've mapped for you already, but now I want to bring us back to the history because I think that conceptual complexity reflects an equally complex history. Now, many historians would, if asked to chart the history of civility, they'd say, oh, well, look, it's a Latin concept. It has this kind of root in Roman civic virtue. Civility is a kind of public spirit and political friendship. But others who are more critical might say, no, civility is about civilization, and specifically a kind of civilizing mission that went hand in hand with the progress of European empires in the New World. So on this view, civility was always about stigmatizing the savage and the barbarians and then suppressing them and making way for the civilized Europeans. In my own history, I want to say it's both, okay? Both histories are true, both matter. But I point to not to classical Rome or to the 18th century history of empire. I point rather to early modernity, to the 16th and 17th centuries, and debates about religious toleration after the Protestant Reformation, as being the crucial context in which the meaning of civility really became clear. And I think that what the history I'm about to describe for you reminds us is that whenever we talk about civility or appeal to civility, we are participating in what we might call a civilizing discourse. We're stigmatizing and threatening potentially to exclude. But I would just point out that not all civilizing discourses are created equal. And so we need to be actually really interested in, okay, what is how is civility being understood, and what is it proposing to exclude in a particular case? Because as we'll see, how you define civility and how you propose to enforce it matters quite a lot for the history of toleration. Okay. Arguably, the first modern crisis of civility was started by none other than Martin Luther, when Luther used a recent innovation in communications technology, namely the printing press, to call the Pope the Antichrist. Now, I think you should think about the printing press in this case as a little bit like Twitter, and Martin Luther is just a really virtuosic troll. We don't tend to think of the Protestant Reformation this way, but I think doing so can help us kind of see how it would have felt to people at the time, right? So Luther calls the Pope the Antichrist. The Pope responds by declaring 41 of Luther's 95 theses heretical. And Luther announces, he's not chastened. He announces himself, quote, unable to pray without at the same time cursing. If I am prompted to say, hallowed be thy name, I must add cursed, damned, and outraged be the name of the papists and all those who slander your name, i.e. Christ. Okay? So the long-standing Protestant tradition of calling Catholics papists or anti-Christians begins here. It's the idea that Catholics are followers of the Antichrist. And of course, the Catholics then give as good as they got. They use traditional labels like heretic, schismatic, or indeed when Pope Leo X excommunicated Luther, he denominated, that is, he named all of Luther's followers Lutherans as a kind of insult, as a way of having them share in Martin's shame. Again, we don't tend to think of these denominational labels as insults, but that is what they were. They were ways of defining one another in opposition on the basis of these fundamental cleavages. So Erasmus, for instance, accused Luther of lowering the conversational tenor and of violating the standard of civility in a way that invited Catholics to respond. But Luther retorted that, look, the truth is always going to be offensive to those who are privileged by the status quo. He wrote, quote, you can't turn the sword to a feather, and the word of God is a sword, unquote. Okay. So many of the self-described evangelical Christians who emerged in Luther's wake took his advice to heart, and often to his chagrin, it must be said. So a particularly striking example of this came in 17th century England with the early Quakers. So the Quakers and other Protestant dissenters participated in many deliberately offensive and enthusiastic forms of evangelism. They did things like take off their clothes in public to go for a sign of their spiritual purity. They would disrupt church services by banging pots and pans. They were really good at insults. And then in one of my favorite cases, a Quaker man, he takes off his pants and he lies down on the communion table in an Anglican church, again, to sort of accuse them of prostituting the offices of Christ, okay? And so the Quakers and other enthusiastic sectarians couple what I call free speech fundamentalism with a principled critique of civility. So like Luther and other dissenters, the Quakers argue that a truly evangelical Christian has a duty to protest and to offend against the sensibilities of the corrupt society in which they live. On this view, civility as a conversational virtue is simply a cover for hypocrisy. One critic wrote, quote, civility doth but wash the outside. The inwards must be washed. A pig may be washed, yet a pig still. Right? In English, we have this phrase that you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. That's the idea, right? Civility is just a hypocritical show. It covers up the sort of the dirtiness and hatred within. By contrast, the spirit of protest at the heart of Protestantism demanded conscientious incivility in the form of disruptive witnessing against the powers that happened to be. And so there's a growing impression in 17th century England that true religion or spiritual righteousness demands incivility. and disruption, right? Disrupting the works of Antichrist wherever you encounter them. And so prosecuting incivility on this view becomes just another way of persecuting dissent, that is, persecuting the righteous by calling them uncivil, trying to get them to shut up. Now, from the 21st century perspective, we look at these early modern conflicts and we say, well, look, guys, the obvious answer, the obvious solution here is tolerance. Right? We'll just agree to allow people to differ in religion and to live together despite. But I think recovering this sense of conflict and uncivil disagreement that I've described helps us understand how not obvious tolerance was as a solution to the problem of religious diversity after the Reformation. Right? Because if you think that the danger isn't just persecution of the sword, but also persecution of the tongue, what we would also call hate speech today, then tolerance is simply a recipe for making it worse. You're telling people of different religious persuasions that they're going to continue to differ and to disagree, but they have to live together, right? And so for someone like Hobbes, he just thinks, look, tolerance is a recipe for incivility and indeed for civil war. A tolerant society cannot be a civil society. Right? So if you care about civility, you cannot tolerate, and if you care about religious freedom, well, you cannot be civil. You must be uncivil. Now, I think that this kind of polarization of the debate might seem familiar, or I'm hoping to suggest that it should seem familiar. But the person I want to talk about now is an early modern evangelical who nevertheless sort of rejected this polarized vision in order to defend civility as, in fact, essential to a tolerant society, but civility in a peculiar way, as mere civility, which I'll now describe for you. Okay, so of course this is Roger Williams. Has anyone heard of Roger Williams? I can't imagine he's that popular in Geneva. No? Not many people have heard of him in the United States either. And don't worry, he's pretty obscure, but I'm going to argue that he's really interesting, and you should get very, very excited about him. Okay, but before I say what he argued, I've got to say a little bit about where he came from. So Roger Williams is one of many Protestants known as Puritans, so these English Calvinists who flee England in the 1630s and move to the British colonies of North America, so to New England. So Williams flees England for New England, not just because he's afraid of being persecuted, but also because he's just really sick of living in a society of sinners. He wants to see what it's like to live in a society of saints. And of course, that's what New England promised. That's what Boston was. It was meant to be a society of saints, where Puritans might live together as it were on a city on a hill, and provide a good example to all of the sinners about what godly and righteous living looked like. Okay? If anyone here has been to Boston, you might think that that didn't work out. Not really a society of saints. But anyway, that was the hope, right? That was the theory. But before Williams even arrives in Boston, he gets a little concerned. He gets a little skeptical. He notices that he calls them the unchristian Christians of New England. He notices that the unchristian Christians of New England have basically stolen the Native Americans' land. And he says that's not a very Christian thing to do. Right? So he begins to really kind of worry about how righteous his fellow Puritans are. But it's not just his defense of Native American land rights and indeed of Native American religion that begin to really annoy his neighbors. No, he also has other offensive opinions. He thinks that women should wear veils in public. He thinks that there shouldn't be civil oaths. Right? People shouldn't be forced to sworn oaths in the courts of law, for example, because that's a religious ceremony. And Williams argues that there needs to be a, quote, wall of separation between church and state, unquote. So this will become very important for the idea of secularism in America. But I think it's counterintuitive to modern audiences because we look at someone like Roger Williams and we say, he is too Puritan for his fellow Puritans. He's a religious zealot. He's an extreme evangelical, but nevertheless, his evangelicalism is leading him to argue for the separation of religion and politics in a principled way. So Williams is so annoying, he never stops telling people that they're wrong, and indeed, he's like Luther. He's one of these uncivil Protestants. He thinks that it's his job to constantly call out his neighbors for their errors. We talk about call-out culture today. It's got nothing on the 17th century Puritans. In the end, he's banished from Massachusetts because he's so annoying. He just won't stop. And he will admit, he's like, okay, look, I know, okay, they banished me for my constant admonishing of them, right? Because he just couldn't stop telling them that they were sinners. Okay? He does this for years. Finally, they kick him out. And they do so in the dead of winter. He is almost certainly to die, except he's in fact taken in by some of the local American Indian tribes, the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. And it's these tribes who then basically feel sorry for him, and they give him this plot of land on which he builds the town of Providence, and this becomes later the colony of Rhode Island. Okay? So Williams is someone that today we would look at and say he's very tolerant. He's also a virtuoso of religious insult or hate speech. He never talks about Catholics. He always talks about anti-Christians. He never talks about Native Americans. He always calls them barbarians and devil worshippers. He likes the word infidel a lot. He's constantly using it. But what's interesting from the modern perspective is that he is using these slurs as a way of arguing for religious toleration. Indeed, he even pleads to Parliament itself in England for the toleration of American Indian religion. He says devil worshippers should be free to worship the devil too, right? Okay, so this is very radical, and it's pretty unexpected, in fact. But Williams is always emphatic that he's so convinced of the sinfulness of those who describe themselves as pure or true Christians, that he's always looking out for the goodness among infidels. And he says, and I find this very moving, he says, look, one must go out of the world entirely if one would not keep converse with idolaters. The argument there is he's been banished from the society of saints, and it's the idolaters who take him in. And that spirit of hospitality makes him realize that, look, a society doesn't need to share a religion in order to function. And this leads to a radical experiment in Rhode Island with toleration. It's not just a toleration of different kinds of Protestants or Christians. Williams argues that we can tolerate American Indian religion, we can tolerate Judaism, and also Islam. And most surprisingly of all, he argues that Protestants in New England can even tolerate Catholics, which is not something that John Locke would argue 50 years later. The idea that Catholics were intolerant and therefore should not be tolerated was the common line for centuries. Already in the 1640s, Williams is saying, no, we can also tolerate Catholic anti-Christians. Okay. Williams comes to this radically inclusive position because he becomes convinced that every person is simply righteous in their own eyes. This idea that we're somehow going to determine what is right and then impose it is going to fail because, quote, that ourselves and all men are apt and prone to differ, that either part or party is most right in its own eye, his cause right, his carriage right, his arguments right, his answers right. This is no new thing in all the ages of the world. So the idea there is that for Williams, it is human nature to regard oneself as righteous. So any system is going to have to presume that everyone regards him or herself as equally right. So his answer then was a system of religious liberty, but not just religious liberty and disestablishment, but also liberty of conscience and freedom of speech. Williams's society of Rhode Island was a society where everyone had an equal right to proselytize. And thus, as you might imagine, it was the site of many very uncivil disagreements. But Williams comes to the conclusion that civility, nevertheless, is the kind of bond or virtue that makes it possible for us to disagree, and disagree fundamentally, but nevertheless continue to share a life together. And indeed, there's only one group that ever challenges his conviction that this is possible. That group was, of course, the Quakers. Williams was really concerned about the Quaker propensity not just to take off their pants, that was annoying. He was concerned about what he saw as the Quakers' uncivil silence. The idea that whenever they got into a religious disagreement with someone, they would fall into silent prayer as a way of stopping the conversation. And Williams found this completely maddening. Right? He says it's the nature of a tolerant society for us to disagree fundamentally and remain committed to civil disagreement, to fighting these battles with words and not with swords. And so he began to think, well, maybe the Quakers are themselves intolerable. There you have that Popperian, that Popper paradox of tolerance. We cannot tolerate the intolerant. But of course, Williams ultimately decides, no, we've got to tolerate these people. What I'll do is I'll debate them. I'm going to debate them for 3 days, and he's so old and ill at this point that he has to be carried into the venue on his sickbed, but he nevertheless debates the Quakers for 3 days. I think it's an example of what will become this American mantra of the answer to is always more speech. That's always Williams's line. The answer is always more speech. Okay. So from the outsider's perspective, they're looking at what Williams is doing in Rhode Island. They say, this is not civil. This is not a civil society. Indeed, they call it Rogues Island. They call it the latrine of New England, like the sewer, because basically all of the cast-offs from the other colonies are ending up in Rhode Island and just having these horrible fights. But nevertheless, it's also the most tolerant society that the world had ever seen at that point. The achievement in Rhode Island is remarkable. But what I argue in my book is that it's not the sort of tolerant society that you ever would have designed in theory. It's only the sort of tolerant society that you would come up with in practice. And the key for this experiment, as Williams called it, was this virtue mere civility. Okay, well, take this step back now and say, okay, well, what does civility look like in a society like Rhode Island? Well, one point is that it doesn't look like the kind of respectful disagreement. Certainly it doesn't look like the kind of civil silence that sometimes I think modern liberals can expect, right? But Williams was committed to rejecting this idea that a tolerant society can't tolerate the intolerant. He thought that living alongside the intolerant and trying to persuade them that they were wrong was the point. That was the point of a tolerant society, of arguing it out, trying to persuade. And so the fear always was that if a tolerant society begins to pick and choose its materials, it won't remain a tolerant society. It will then become preoccupied with whether or not it's excluding the right people. So we thought instead what we needed to do in a tolerant society was to commit ourselves to talking about our differences and disagreeing face to face. Now, on this view, a civil society is one with a lot of disagreement, and that disagreement feels disagreeable. But civility becomes a virtue of becoming able to tolerate the disagreeableness of disagreement and have the courage to have those disagreements face to face. A civil society wasn't a just society on this view, but it was a society where its members nevertheless remained committed to pursuing justice together. We have serious disagreements about justice. We don't at all see eye to eye on what it demands, but we recognize the fact that we share this society and we pursue justice in a way that doesn't undermine the possibility of sharing that society tomorrow. So there's plenty of calling out of injustice in Williams's tolerant society. But for him, it was always, are you willing to call out and continue to converse with the people that you regard as in error or even damned? Not call them out and then complain about them to your friends. Not complain about them behind their back and talk about how terrible or bigoted they are, but to talk to them and try to persuade them that they're wrong, right? So if we think about that, we begin to see, well, look, oh wow, a tolerant society is going to be often a very uncomfortable place to be. Civility becomes then a kind of virtue of committing ourselves to doing that disagreement and putting up with that discomfort. And remaining committed to working with the people we regard as standing in our way, instead of trying to work around them and get them excluded, right? Why does Williams think we need to commit ourselves to that? Well, he thinks, look, I tried the Society of Saints, and it wasn't that great, right? So the Society of Sinners is often all we have. But we need to try to make the most of the society of sinners that we share together. And so I'll conclude with just a few thoughts. One thought is, in the 21st century, as in the 17th century, I think if you're talking about civility as a way of avoiding a disagreement, you're doing civility wrong. If you're saying that civility requires that we keep silent about the questions that divide us most deeply, again, I think that's not leading to a civil disagreement, that's eliminating disagreement, that's demanding silence. Civility also helps us recognize that disagreement is disagreeable, but it's not intrinsically disrespectful. If I disagree with you, yes, there's that element of sort of feeling a kind of frisson or insult, but the fact of disagreement is not itself disrespectful. And finally, I think that mere civility encourages us to resist that temptation of achieving a tolerant society through exclusion by pushing those we sincerely believe to be beyond the pale outside of the bounds of our society. And I think just one of the things I'll leave you with is very often that element of exclusion is something that we're not even doing ourselves because we're engaging with people online. And the algorithm is sorting us into these like-minded communities without our even knowing it. And if we're only speaking to the like-minded, then disagreement becomes even more disagreeable. We become even worse at having those disagreements when they happen, right? So there are challenges, sure, but I think that we mustn't give up on civility. So I'll end by saying 2 cheers for civility, okay? 2 cheers. A tolerant society needs it and will miss it when it's gone. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons du temps pour des questions et des micros dans la salle. Qui en a? S'il vous plaît. Monsieur, ici au milieu. Merci.
J'ai 3 questions, mais elles sont très simples et très courtes. L'une, c'est une question aux absents. Pourquoi n'y a-t-il que 100 personnes, moins de 100 personnes dans cette salle, alors que le sujet est sans doute le plus explosif de la société moderne, en particulier ces jours à Genève, et pas seulement à cause des questions d'entartage. Ma seconde question, vous avez... Excusez-moi si vous préférez, je parle anglais, mais je crois que vous parlez mieux le français que je ne parle anglais.
Il y a une traduction simultanée.
Oui. Vous avez cité Karl Popper. Comment Popper traiterait l'affaire Galilée dans le contexte de tolérance-intolérance? Est-ce qu'un scientifique, est-ce qu'en science, on doit parfois trancher? Voilà. Et puis, ma troisième question... Il y a quelque temps, j'ai entendu un historien que vous connaissez peut-être, Pierre Nora, expliquer qu'il avait fermé sa revue, une revue qu'il avait créée, qui s'appelle Le Débat. Il lui a demandé pourquoi vous l'avez fermée au lieu de la passer à la jeune génération. Il a dit parce que le débat n'est plus possible dans notre société. Il y a eu une période limitée dans les années 60, 70, 80, où le débat était possible, il n'était pas possible avant, il n'est plus possible après, je ne voulais pas faire semblant. Alors, que pensez-vous de pourquoi il y a des périodes où le débat est possible et des périodes où il semble devenu impossible, même au prix, même s'il faut sacrifier la vérité, on ne veut plus discuter.
Merci. Thank you for those questions. So as to the first, I couldn't possibly say. It's been so well advertised, and we have these great posters. I'm sorry that more people can't be here. I will say that, this is a book that I published in 2017 first, and then it was revised and republished in 2019, and I continue to be invited to come and give talks like this. And it shows me that there really is a sense of a pressing need and appetite for trying to work through these questions. So I'll continue to talk as long as people will have me. The second question on Popper, I make an example of Popper a bit in my lecture. I think Popper himself is less certain about the paradox of tolerance, but he certainly is very worried about the enemies of a free society and a tolerant society. In terms of applying it to science directly, for Popper, science is, makes progress through falsification. So the idea that we would rule certain arguments or certain people out. I think there's a kind of skepticism of that. We've got to make sure that we're always opening ourselves up to challenge. But finally, on this example of the debate, I mean, I think it's always worth thinking about etymology. And the word debate comes from, again, from Latin, but it's the idea of beating down. So to debate means I'm sort of beating down your argument. And I think that maybe young people today are more sensitive to the ways in which debate can be unpleasant and risky. But I wouldn't, I think that there can be quite a lot of hand-wringing about, kids these days or things like that. I don't think that's quite right. I really do, I think maybe you suggested there's these cycles, right, where we valorize debate in the kind of cut and thrust in a very masculine, very often way. And then we become more sensitive to the ways in which that way of conducting a disagreement can leave certain people out. And so my hope always is that our rising sensitivity to, the harm, maybe not harm, but the disagreeableness of disagreement is just a prelude to welcoming more people in and saying we can all disagree together and people can have an equal voice and participate in that disagreement as equals. That's my hope.
Il y a une question au dernier rang.
Moi, j'aimerais parler parce que j'ai pas le sentiment, mais c'est très personnel, que notre société est très tolérante. J'ai l'impression que le contraire se produit plutôt, notamment au niveau de la liberté d'expression. Et en cela, je rejoins monsieur là. J'aimerais parler du politiquement correct qui nous est tombé dessus comme quelque chose. Enfin, personnellement, je trouve que c'est pas très positif parce que justement, on n'ose plus parler. Il y a plein de mots qu'on n'ose plus utiliser. On revisite l'histoire à juste titre ou pas. Voilà. Mais je trouve que la liberté d'expression se réduit comme peau de chagrin, en fait. Oui. Par rapport parce qu'on revisite l'histoire, parce que y a plein de choses qu'on n'ose plus dire, plus faire. Moi, j'ai connu les périodes que monsieur mentionnait, là, où effectivement, on ne se posait pas tellement de questions, et puis j'ai pas l'impression que les gens étaient blessés ou prenaient mal. C'est comme par exemple le harcèlement sexuel. Bon, c'est un autre débat, mais moi je me suis jamais sentie harcelée. On appréciait que les messieurs nous fassent des compliments, voire nous ciblent dans la rue. Ben oui, c'était sympa. On l'acceptait, c'était un signe, voilà. Et tout ça disparaît petit à petit pour une société qui devient un peu grise, un peu tristounette, je trouve.
Thank you. So, I mean, I have a few thoughts in response to that. One is, I don't think we can. I don't think we should overlook the extent to which this is a generational conflict. I think that mores have changed very quickly, and I think very often older people can feel a bit at sea because it seems like the culture has shifted very fast. Conversely, I think that young people can feel very angry and alienated, right? And my approach is always trying to find a way of, can we have a productive disagreement about this thing that we feel is dividing us? That's my hope, right? And one of the strategies I use is appealing to history. Because I think if we look to history, we can look at these examples of, you use the phrase political correctness. It's very much a phrase, that we use in the US. But part of what I'm arguing is that political correctness is not a new phenomenon. All of these arguments in the 17th century about the politics of language, these are old worries, right? And if we can look at concerns about how people are speaking in other historical periods, I think hopefully it can lower our sense of risk. So that feeling you described that I can't say anything now, you know, people are policing what I say. Certainly there's more attention, I think, to the language that we use and the effects that it has on people. But I also always try to say to my students, look, disagreeing is always risky. Saying what you think is always risky, right? But the point is that you've got to be brave and you've got to learn how to tolerate some risk. And I think it's only once we get back to this idea of, okay, yes, it's fraught, yes, we're sensitive to the ways our words can affect people in ways that we weren't before, but go back to that business of disagreeing and working together to make society more just. And I have a hope, and it's a hope, but I think, frankly, a tolerant society is based on a kind of unreasonable hope that this is possible. But I hope that, you know, this sort of feeling of crisis with respect to disagreement and free speech, that we're sort of turning a corner with this, in fact. And that it's able, you know, I think we're in a position now where we might be able to think more about sharing meanings and sharing commitments instead of just retreating into our camps and talking about how terrible the other side is. That's not productive.
Monsieur, ici, avec le... Non, monsieur derrière d'abord, pardon. Ensuite, il y a quelqu'un au deuxième rang et puis vous êtes après.
Je voulais poser la question, si les algorithmes sont un risque ou si vous voyez plutôt que les algorithmes sont une possibilité dans le débat ou si vous avez des algorithmes qui favorisent le débat plutôt qui séparent ou qui diminuent en fait ces trois concepts de tolérance, civilité et puis limite d'expression.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that question. I think that's a really interesting area. I think what we've seen over the past few years, and obviously I defer, there are probably people here with much more expertise than I, the tendency on social media has been to reward what we might call homophily. This idea of the agreeableness of likeness. And so allowing people to find like-minded communities and sort into these much smaller groups. And it's interesting that, you know, that's a very human tendency. Homophily is a very human tendency. But technology has allowed us in a way to slip the bonds of the body or material existence. You know, there are always limits to homophily in the sense of that you're stuck with a body living with whoever happens to live next to you, right? Having more freedom to sort means that we tend to sort ourselves into these like-minded enclaves. But I think that you're absolutely right that the challenge then for algorithmic designers in considerations of algorithmic justice is how do we then use these tools to constitute communities that have disagreements, that sort of resist that pull of homophily.
Monsieur au deuxième rang ici.
Donc je vous remercie de votre proposition selon laquelle vous encouragez à soutenir l'inconfort du désaccord. Donc je vous en remercie parce que cet inconfort fait violence aux partis qui se sentent en désaccord. Ce que j'observe, c'est qui décide des règles de la civilité et que les règles décidées de cette civilité fait-elle violence à ceux qui veulent ne plus les respecter. En conséquence, s'il y a de la violence, il me semble que c'est, entre guillemets, au parti dominant de mettre à disposition les possibilités de soutenir les désaccords de manière civilisée. Et certainement avec de la méthode, et certainement avec des règles, avec des valeurs. Et c'est un peu la question que je me pose, parce que aujourd'hui, on voit plutôt que les dominants condamnent, discriminent, traitent de complotistes ou de poutinistes, en fait, ceux qui voilà, sont contre aujourd'hui les gros débats sur la Covid passée et la guerre russo-ukrainienne. Donc, est-ce parce que la société ne met pas suffisamment en place des situations de débat qu'on va vers des tensions qui vont s'aggravant?
thank you. So again, there are sort of a number of points to make. One, with your initial point about who decides what's civil. I mean, I alluded to this in the talk, I'll say it explicitly. I mean, one of the most interesting things about studying the history of civility is that anyone who theorizes about civility always has themselves in mind as the exemplar of what civil disagreement looks like. It's uncanny that the model of civility is always the person who happens to be speaking. I myself am probably guilty of this, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But who decides in certain, different conversational contexts are going to be constituted around different norms of civility. So we might say that the norms of civility in an academic, in a university, in an academic setting, are not going to be the same as the norms in the British House of Commons, for instance, or in social media or online. Right? So one point about civility is just to think about what are the different conversational contexts and what are the norms of disagreement that are appropriate in each case. They will be different. But this point about power is very important. I think that those in positions of privilege and power in constituting those sites then need to exercise restraint in the suppression side, good judgment and restraint in deciding which views and the manner in which views are expressed, what gets excluded. My position is always to err on the side of inclusion. And that's my commitment. And but again, I think there are people who would disagree, and we could say inclusion is appropriate in certain contexts, but not in others. But I think already there, we're going to have a more fruitful discussion if we're thinking about it as different codes of civility as pertinent to different conversational contexts. But the point about violence, again, that's also like Williams, that was ultimately the arbiter of what was civil and what was uncivil. For Williams, it was, we can fight with swords or we can fight with words. And so long as you were committed to fighting with words, he was pretty tolerant of whatever it was that you happened to say. I think we've heard concerns from other audience members that I think a lot of people today worry that they can't say what they think because they're afraid of being labeled. And the way that labels work, I think, to try to determine the boundaries of acceptable opinion in a society. I think we've got to be aware of the way that these labels function. Of course, I talk historically. I talk about labels like Lutheran. We don't tend to think of that as an insult today. But it was. It was about trying to say, that's who you are, and who you are is beyond the pale. We don't accept that here. My own approach, again, is to say we should focus less on the labels and I think sometimes the response is, well, people shouldn't be allowed to label each other in that way. I think that's just policing speech, again. Sure, use these labels. These labels are heuristics. They help us make sense of what the positions are. But again, then we should be tolerant with respect to the sorts of labels that we are willing to engage with. And that, I think, is where we fall short. I think very often people use labels as then a reason or even an excuse for why they don't have to engage with somebody. And ultimately, you're going to do a bit of that because, we're frail, finite, we don't have lots of time. I mean, you can't engage in a debate with everybody, you can't disagree with everybody. But again, I just want us to be really conscious of when we're leaning or relying on labels to do work that maybe we should be doing in argument ourselves. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed your talk. So I wanted to point out one of the assumptions in your analysis, which you mentioned clearly, and that is that the human being in mind here is a Hobbesian person. Right? They have a strong sense of righteousness, and they have a strong ego. And my point is that, those qualities can be worked on by us as individuals. We can lower our sense of righteousness. We can work to divorce our intellectual positions from who we are as people, from our identities. And in that case, you can have a disagreement with someone, a really intense intellectual disagreement with someone, but without feeling that you're being violated. And that creates the context for a very compassionate discussion, one of, genuine intellectual exchange. And so I just wanted to just highlight that there's a model of a human being here, which is not necessarily the model of every human being. And I think that was worth pointing out. And then quickly, a second point, just because some of the others have raised it here, is that, everyone will have a different conception of what free speech should and should not entail. And when you approach it from that angle, what matters more is the process by which those disagreements are resolved. Okay? Now, if you take Hobbes' analysis, he would say, we need a sovereign. You need to assign one person. They have all power. They decide. And that's in the interest of society. Now, we obviously don't believe that in our more modern context. So we believe in democracy, right? And in Switzerland, of all countries in the world, we have direct democracy. So we have sovereignty. The people are sovereign, not in name, right? Not only in name, but through the referendum instrument, right? That's how we express our sovereignty in this country. And so the point I want to make is that I think the process matters a lot more than the position, the individual conception of free speech. And it's the process that gives the whatever is arrived at by society legitimacy and the potential for revision into the future. And so when we talk about generational divides, for instance, well, we can have those debates, and then we can have a referendum. Maybe we can adjust the constitution or adjust the law, whatever you have to do, to maybe tailor it a little bit. Right? And then sort of finally, that process itself has values, right? If you just give a sovereign, an individual, the power to say whatever they think is free speech, that has a content which is sort of, I would say, somewhat, there's a lack of respect that's afforded to everyone else. But in a democratic context, that has value as to what free speech means in order to be able to execute that process and to have that legitimacy. Okay, so yeah, there's maybe a lot there, but those are some of the points I wanted to make.
Are you a political theorist?
No. I did physics, astrophysics at University, and now I work for the United Nations in trade.
Very good. Yeah. Well, so not everyone here will be familiar with Thomas Hobbes's masterpiece, Leviathan. But yeah, the solution that Hobbes offers there to the disagreeableness of disagreement is, as the questioner indicates, he says, look, basically we need a sovereign, that sort of one person or assembly who's going to decide. There was a scholar, Sheldon Wolin, who described the Hobbesian sovereign as the great definer. And the idea is the Hobbesian sovereign is going to define all words subject to controversy. So you might think in debates today, for instance, over gender and sexuality and these things, Hobbes would just say, the sovereign gets to decide what a woman is. And that's the end of the question, right? We don't live in a Hobbesian society. We say, look, we decide these things through public discussion and debate and disagreement. That's how they're decided. Or some things we can't decide or won't decide, we take them off the table. Right? And so I am interested also in those off-the-table strategies. Because I think sometimes when we say, oh, we've got to come to a disagreement, that means that one side is going to win, the other is going to lose. It encourages this sense of zero-sumness. Right? So what happened with religious toleration, in most cases, was this idea for Williams, right? You don't have an established church. So it's not a fight about which church is going to get all the money. No one does. Right? So there are also those strategies I don't want to lose sight of. But whether or not, what are my psychological assumptions? Certainly, I'm attracted to these early modern arguments because I think they have a kind of psychological realism, if you will, where they think about the affective dimension of disagreement. But you're absolutely right to say not every individual experiences disagreement in the same way. Even if Hobbes is right that everyone feels that sort of disagreeableness, we might naturally be more or less insensitive to it, etc. And we can do this ethical work where we make progress with respect to it. And I think you'll have noticed that that's a big part of what I'm arguing. Mere civility is committing ourselves to doing the disagreements that enable us to do the ethical work. Where we are able to make that separation between persons and positions that you described. But I suppose my one sort of, just to push back is just to say that's not easy and it's not possible for everyone. And I think that very often people who like to disagree or like to debate are maybe not tolerant enough of people who find it harder, right? And so I think, again, just we're different. We're starting from different places. We've got to be willing to sort of do this rather hard work.
Y a-t-il d'autres questions? Oui, question ici, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, merci. Donc, on se posait un peu une question par rapport à tout ce débat. C'est que dans cette période historique, on voit que c'est une question de civilité et de tolérance sur la base d'idées. Surtout, enfin, d'une certaine manière. Alors, on peut considérer comme quoi ces idées ont fait partie d'un sens très profond de ce qu'ils sont ou elles sont. Mais parfois, en fait, on est tout simplement. Et il y a des discours qui se veulent de l'expression, faire partie de la liberté d'expression, qui nient en fait ces existences, ou qui les péjorent, qui les mettent dans un statut qui est inférieur au leur. Et je pense que c'est vrai que moi, ça me parle beaucoup Karl Popper, son paradoxe. Parce que autant sur des idées aujourd'hui, peut-être qu'on a réussi, on a cette distance-là de voir que ces questions religieuses sont des positions surtout d'idées, mais c'est pas qui on est. C'est pas fondamentalement rattaché à comment on est dans notre propre corps. C'est par rapport à des questions théologiques, c'est des questions aussi d'éthique, aussi de lecture des Écritures, etc. Mais là, c'est comme si des personnes pour elles-mêmes, dans ce qu'elles vivent, dans ce qu'elles peuvent vivre, dans ce qu'elles sont amenées à vivre, on leur disait, bah, du coup, en fait, tu vas vivre moins bien. On va te le dire, on va te le répéter, on va dire, tu n'as pas le droit de te dire comme ça, tu n'as pas le droit de te définir comme ça, parce que cette catégorie est utilisée pour des autres, et puis après, on est mis dans une position où, en fait, si on se tait, on meurt. Donc on est obligé de parler face à des personnes qui peuvent dire ce qu'elles veulent. Elles ont une position dans laquelle notre existence, elle n'est pas encore considérée comme légitime. Notre histoire, elle n'est pas encore là. Et on doit se battre sans cesse. Et j'ai l'impression que le concept de mere civility ne fonctionne évidemment vraiment plus, même pour à ce niveau-là, quoi. Voilà.
Thank you. Good. So yeah, a number of really important points there. I mean, so one thought is the thought that the kinds of historical disagreements and differences I'm talking about, there's a fundamental disanalogy between contemporary questions of identity and existence versus early modern doctrinal disputes or disagreements about belief. Good. So one point I'd make is that the idea that religious difference was primarily a matter of belief in the early modern era, I think it's not quite right, because what's really profound, I think the Quakers capture this as well, is that it's not just about believing, it's also about living a righteous life. So living in a particular way, living in a godly community. And for the Quakers, that's dressing a certain way, that's speaking a certain way. I've written about the Quaker politics of pronouns. So the Quakers are insistent on using thee and thou, so twoing instead of vooing, right? Using the familiar first-person pronouns. And so this is actually, in terms of what makes people angry and what makes them react violently to what the Quakers are doing, and they're victims of so much persecution. It's this idea that they are, it's not just that they believe differently, it's that they're living differently in a way that's meant to call other people out, right? So it's this feeling of like, you're more godly than I am, right? So again, we might say it's still disanalogous, and it might well be, but I just think we shouldn't sort of flatten out maybe the kinds of differences that were at stake in these historical debates. But your question, I take it to be about this kind of a concern about certain kinds of free speech is undermining the equality of certain vulnerable and marginalized groups. And that's something that I really worry about. If you think about feminist arguments in the 1980s about pornography, the idea, what's objectionable about pornography is that when it speaks, it says something about the inferiority of women. Right? So it's stigmatizing speech, and it's also silencing speech. If you have a culture distorted by misogynistic porn, it means that women can't speak, or when they speak, they aren't heard. Right? So this idea that no means yes, right? And so that analysis by feminist scholars in the 1980s, I think, has been rightly now extended to lots of different kinds of difference. And debates about gender today, I think, are very much in the same vein, where we worry that certain kinds of speech work to stigmatize and undermine the legitimacy of certain ways of being and certain gender identities. And so in my work on free speech, I argue that when we say free speech, we don't just mean I should have the license to say whatever I have in mind. We say, as a society, we should make it possible for every person to be able to speak as an equal, right? For every person to be able to have, I can see you're not persuaded by what I've just said, but I will finish what I'm saying. It's the idea that everybody needs to be able to speak up and out and be heard. And the question then is, how do we achieve that? Right? I think it's really difficult. But I think that the idea that we're going to achieve that best by making it more difficult for people to, I don't know, talk about the things that they feel strongly about, I think that's a losing strategy. Right? So my hope is that we find ways of sharing a language, sharing a common ground, and being able to recognize each other as equals. And that's the way forward. That's how we're going to work together. But I agree that the problems you raise are important ones. Yeah. So I think it's about equality.
There is one more question.
Bonsoir et merci pour la conférence. Je me demande, est-ce qu'on peut encore qualifier nos sociétés de tolérantes? Est-ce qu'on a le temps? Est-ce que cette société a le temps aujourd'hui d'être tolérante? Parce que même un débat pour le mettre en place, on doit partir quand même un peu du même socle et j'ai l'impression qu'on n'a jamais le temps.
I wasn't expecting that to be the objection, but that's good. That's a profound worry. Yeah. So, do we live in tolerant societies? I mean, partly by me insisting on that label, it's partly to raise the question: do we live in tolerant societies? And if we did, what would that look like? What defines a tolerant society? I mean, one of my arguments historically is that it was never a debate about whether we should tolerate or not tolerate. It was always about how much religious difference can we stand. So in a way, it's not, to go back to Popper, it's not the sort of tolerant versus intolerant. I think it's really difficult to determine who is tolerant and who's intolerant, and the line is shifting all the time. And I have a kind of skepticism about our judgments. And in a way, I suppose what attracts me to someone like Roger Williams is I'm not a Christian, I'm not an evangelical Christian, certainly. But there is something about that evangelical sensibility that I find really moving. This idea that anyone, the person I see today as my enemy, tomorrow could be my ally, right? I think that's profound, and I think it's profoundly important for democracies. But as you say, that kind of work is very time-consuming. And I agree with you that there is a kind of sense of a lack of space just for the kind of work that we would need to do to be able to belong together. And going back to this question of algorithms, there's, part of what this algorithmic sorting does is save time for us, to save us the unpleasantness of wading through the disagreeableness and all that. But there's a real loss that comes from that. And I suppose I haven't said it yet, but I will say it. I mean, when I talk about civility as the kind of solution, you know, as something that, mere civility is something that's really important in tolerant societies, it's not because I think that it's going to solve any of the problems we've been discussing and the very important concerns that have been raised. I don't think it's going to solve any of it. But what civility does is it helps us to manage a condition that is fundamentally problematic, right? These are not problems that get solved. They're problems that get managed, and then hopefully over time, we learn to deal with them productively, and something else suddenly becomes the thing that seems much more problematic. And that, I think, is very often how social change happens and how social progress is made.
There is one more question in the front row.
Merci beaucoup, c'était vraiment très intéressant. Vous avez expliqué comment la civilité permettait de mieux supporter le côté désagréable de la tolérance. Et puis, avec l'exemple de Williams, j'avais l'impression qu'il avait une autre dialectique en plus, puisqu'il était tellement pénible avec tout le monde, c'est qu'il poussait les gens aussi à la transparence. Il poussait les gens à exprimer, en fait, de manière transparente leur position. Et c'est une thématique que vous n'avez pas du tout traitée dans cette présentation, mais je me demandais si la transparence, pousser les gens à la transparence, c'est pas aussi une autre méthode en comparaison de la civilité. Enfin, c'est pas forcément une contradiction, hein, mais une autre méthode qui permet de renforcer la tolérance ou bien la dynamique sociale là, en général.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the idea is that Williams he just wants people to be more honest. You know, stop being, you know, I have that quote about civility and hypocrisy. It's about stop being hypocrites, actually say what you think. And if you actually take the risk and have the courage of saying what you think, you may find that richer forms of common life are possible, or progress is possible that you wouldn't otherwise make. I mean, that's appealing. I think that is an important aspect of what Williams is up to. But on the other hand, I think Williams is also really clear on one of the reasons he's so emphatic about the separation of church and state and religion and politics is because he thinks religion is the site of sincerity. In religion, it is absolutely essential that we be honest because salvation is at stake. But in order to make that honesty tolerable, he thinks that in the civil sphere, sometimes we've got to be willing to be hypocrites, okay? And so I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple examples. I'll only give one example. Okay, two examples. So the polite form of address in Massachusetts Bay is to call someone Goodman such and such. So I said Professor Hurst. I'll say Goody Hurst would be the polite way of saying. Roger Williams points out, I don't know that she's good. Okay. Maybe I know she's bad, and so I'm lying when I say Goody Hurst. But the point is that in civil life, we sort of commit ourselves to these lies and this kind of hypocrisy that makes it possible for us to be honest about the things that really matter. Right? And I think that the question then gets raised, how do we then distinguish? How do we draw that line? I think the lines move, but the need to make those distinctions doesn't go away. And specifically, a tolerant society is committed to the idea that we can share a life together with people whom we don't regard as good people. And that's really like, once you put it that way, you're like, oh, right, okay. That's hard. And so there is a place for hypocrisy as well as honesty. I have other examples, but you can ask me later.
I think we've reached the end of the time we had. Thank you so much for the excellent questions. Thank you, Professor Bejan, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.